Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Rumpistol, Going Inside. Alright, Rumpistol. I've been covering this Norwegian artist for a minute now. You can check the description for the full discography review I've done on him. If you've missed any of the previous times I've covered him, this guy started out as a pretty decent IDM artist in the early 2000s, putting out lots of high-detail, glitchy mixes that went out of their way to feel very casual and carefree and laid back. Back when I was first introduced to him sometime in 2019, I thought he was alright. He had one genuinely excellent album in Dynamo from 2008, and his self-titled debut from 2003 has a few great individual moments. But the rest of his work didn't stand out to me that much among the crowd of other artists in the same vein I'd listened to, such as Fortet or Caribou, among many others. But around 2018, he apparently suffered like a stress-related breakdown in which looking at computer screens would give him headaches and nausea, which eventually resulted in him completely changing his approach to music making for his sixth album, After the Flood, in 2020, which was a very spare and minimal piano-driven modern classical album, followed by a more instrumentally dense and jazz-centric take on the same sound for his seventh album last year, Isola. And both of those albums were absolutely incredible. As it turns out, he could pull me in way more effortlessly as a neoclassical composer than he could as an IDM sound designer, and he could hit on such a deep emotional level that I did not fully realize he had in him. After the Flood was my number 4 favorite album of that year, and Isola was my number 2 favorite of last year, and to be honest, in spirit, Isola is tied for number 1, and only did not take that spot because the other artist was even more obscure. I want to give more shine to him. Literally, that was the only tiebreaker. Isola is one of those albums that feels like it's going to go down as an all-time classic. Between how many evocative instrumental textures and ideas there were, how spot on the melodic composition of every single track was, that had just the right balance between easily memorable and distinct, but also completely nailing all the emotional vibes they were going for, and perfectly sequencing them as well as a perfect album to process grief and sorrow to. I cannot heap enough praise onto how incredible that album is. And I was pretty honored when Rumpistol included quotes from my review in some of his social media promos for the album. Needless to say, when I saw he was going to be making a third piano record and turning his piano work into a completed trilogy, I was pretty hyped to find out what he'd be delivering this time around. Apparently, this album was designed around the idea of psychedelic therapy and inner journeys, conceived when he spent 5 days in early 2022 in a cabin isolated on his own, and he just had a big creative outpouring. And he even got some feedback from scientific researchers in the psychedelic therapy field on how to execute his compositions to resonate with people on that specific level, not unlike what Marconi Union did that one time, or I guess more specifically what John Hopkins did for his last album. And the album even reinforces that theme with its track titles, which seem to form vague sentences about going on such a psychedelic inner journey. Be Here Now, The Way Out Is In, Surrender to Love, Trust, Let Go, etc. Also, 2 tracks are given titles arranging letters to make them visually resemble waves going in and out. BBBODDD and DDDOBBB. I'm just gonna call those the inwards wave one and the outwards wave one for the sake of simplicity. I didn't know what to fully expect, but if his last 2 records were anything to go by, then I had a strong feeling that this was once again going to be something special. And on first listen, yeah, it gave me exactly what I wanted based on his descriptions of it. Taking the deeply sad and grief-stricken approach of those albums and applying them to some compositions that feel more emotionally hopeful and determined, I suppose. This one, more than the other 2, feels like it most could be ready to soundtrack a Zelda-type adventure or something to that effect, while very much sitting within the same delicate and down-to-earth territory. Maybe some tracks were clicking with me more than others, but hey, maybe with more repeat lessons it could grow on me to sit closer to the level of his last 2. And that didn't really happen. I've been sitting with this album for a week and a half and have probably heard it a good 8 times by now, but it was always a clear step away from how deep his last 2 albums hit me, and honestly I think it might have even ever so slightly shrunk on me the more time I spent with it. Now that's obviously not to say I didn't like it. At the absolute worst, I still think this album is really freaking good and bordering on great. Half of this album is definitely able to hit for me on a similar level to the stuff on his last 2 albums, and the other half is still very solid. But there were a number of tracks here that didn't really stick with me in the way that I'd hoped, that ended up feeling like they came a bit too close to ideas he did on his last 2 albums and weren't able to match up to them or stand on their own as well. In fact, I'll quickly get those less stellar tracks out of the way first. For one thing, there's the vocal tracks on this album, like Now, Let Go, or Is In, which I wanted to like more than I think I actually do. They're still really nice, the vocals are very calming, just as they were on E-Solo when they appeared, but they kind of just feel like offshoots of tracks from that album, such as Memento Mori or Slumber Sleufer, that don't stand out as much or carry as important stakes. Now is definitely the best of those 3. It acts as a solid transitional breather in between 2 tracks which do have higher stakes. Is In is my least favorite track here, probably. It gets a bit cliche in its warm major key pleasantness and just ended up not really being that interesting. Even if I do like the entire last minute of that one being dedicated to pure field recordings of birds. Let Go is definitely the most well-defined track of those 3, and again, I do like the vocals, but the piano and string composition underneath it, while effectively haunting, ends up blending a little too well into the track it immediately follows. And speaking of which, said track, the Inwards Wave one, track 5, that has some nice peaceful string build-ups with cello passages, going up and down, but as well as it's able to nail its mood in the moment, I would not be able to pick it out from a crowd or identify it from a distance among, all the tracks he's done over the past couple of years. It's probably the track on this album that feels the most like filler to me. Now, the Outwards Wave one, track 9, that's definitely more of a standout than its counterpart, as well as being easily the most distinct track to feature vocals on it, notable for being the most minimalistic track out of everything here, with lots of isolated individual notes playing on lots of different instruments covered in reverb, as the singer hums away, presumably in Norwegian. This is definitely the track that grew on me the most as I, actively sat up and listened to this album to write about it for this review, but it also had a bit of a tendency to fall in the background in greater context. This was never one that, I noticed when it came up. But okay, with all that out of the way, let's talk about the good stuff and the biggest reasons why this album is still worth hearing anyway. The opener, Remember, is honestly the best opening track out of all 3 of his piano records, and the best track on this album. The way the delicate piano melodies and the dark and stormy woodwinds wavering between 2 notes come together in such an instantly evocative and easily memorable way, as well as an especially airy and mysterious Asian flute solo at one point. I think that's a duduk. It's definitely a track that makes you feel like you're about to go off on some kind of journey, like you may be leaving your current reality behind, but you promise to return. There's a wariness and a tenseness to it, but also a calmness to it. You're at peace with the fact that this is just something that must be done. Be Here, meanwhile, feels like the point at which the journey has truly begun. There's a lot of rumbling bass synths and muffled thumps acting as percussion going up next to more tense but calm pianos and harps and string arrangements, creating a sense that perhaps danger may be on the horizon, but we're prepared to face it anyway. And Trust kind of conveys a similar feeling of impending danger, but also a lot of haunting ghostliness, as all the wordless vocals and string pads swirl around the pizzicato bass and piano riffs. That's the longest track at nearly 7 minutes, and I barely notice it's any bigger than any other track here. That length is well utilized as we float through various different instrumental textures that make the track feel like it's running on for half the time it actually is. Be Open is one of the most unique ideas here. It starts out with a bunch of layers of plucking synth arpeggios, nice for the reminder of Rumpistol's electronic background, but the rest of the track builds into these very vast and open string pads going over very light jazz drumming. It carries a sense of warm and uplifting relief that hasn't been felt yet on the album, like watching rays of sunlight peek out from behind the clouds for the first time. And that sense of warmer relief is very effectively built upon on The Way Out, which combines its light electric piano riffs with strings and flutes and wordless vocals, going into some of the more complex progressions of harmonies we've gotten on this album, switching off between feeling tense and unsure and feeling relieving and comforting, or somewhere in between with each passing chord. And I also feel like this album has a particularly solid ending. Penultimate track, Surrender, may focus on what sounds like the 4 chords of pop, but the way all the electric pianos, tapping percussion, guitars, pizzicato strings, and especially the fiddle acting as the lead melody and giving the track a bit of like an Irish or Celtic flavor. And when the chord progression switches partway through for a while, it's a fantastic little moment. This is definitely the most positive, uplifting, and mood-brightening track out of anything you'll hear on any of Rumpistol's modern classical albums. And finally, we close with To Love, which may also focus on a bit of a cliched 4-chord progression and doesn't do as much with it, but still gets something fittingly comforting out of all its very slow and straightforward string pads and flute melodies, also bookending itself with that little chime or gong noise similar to the one that the opening track started with. That's a nice touch. And that's everything on Going Inside. Man, I'm really conflicted on this one. I really wanted to say I properly love this album. I'm so damn close to hitting that level. I think half the track listing on this thing does in fact properly hit that level, but I think it comes up the tiniest bit short for me as a complete whole. Where an album like Isola could get every single individual track to contribute a memorable and distinct idea and hit on a deeper emotion, or After the Flood could get all of its tracks to stick through its melodies and composition despite the textural similarity between all of them, on this album there's a bit too many tracks that didn't really add something special or memorable in context. It's definitely the weakest of Rumpistol's piano trilogy, and I can only bring myself to say it's merely very good and not quite great. But obviously it's still going to get a recommendation from me anyway. Not being able to measure up to the likes of After the Flood or Isola is obviously not saying much given how much I've already heaped praise onto those. And I still have to give this album credit for its best moments, which are able to take this album into new territory not touched upon by those last two albums. Just the idea of this album being like the peaceful exhale and recovery from all the darker emotions and feelings of loss and sadness that the last two albums conveyed, I think that's a really nice idea, and it's still executed pretty well regardless of the handful of less interesting moments. And hey, if this does mark the end of his piano trilogy, perhaps that may signal a new era for him going forward. Maybe he'll end up returning to the IDM world and possibly bring some more of the compositional and emotional heft he was able to bring to these albums to a new album sometime in the future. I don't know. But I'm still looking forward to whatever Rumpistol ends up doing next, and for all my issues with this project, I still see it as another strong effort to add on to his now 20 years of musical output. Give it a shot. I'm overall feeling a very strong 7.7 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, the link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.